Deep in New England's wilderness, a hidden camera captures something extraordinary. Michael Foster, a homeless man seeking shelter, discovers an abandoned cabin and begins pouring his heart into restoring it. Each careful repair tells the story of a man rebuilding not just a home, but his own sense of purpose. What he doesn't know is that Sarah Blackwood, a reclusive billionaire worth $20 billion, has been watching. Tired of a world where every relationship comes with a price tag, she sees in Michael's selfless dedication something that touches her soul. Pure, unfiltered authenticity. As their paths collide, both will discover that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't found in bank accounts, but in the genuine connections we forge when we least expect them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Michael Foster stood in the rain outside Riverside Woodworks, his weathered leather tool belt heavy in his hands. 23 years of craftsmanship, reduced to a cardboard box of personal items and a pink slip that was already dissolving in the downpour. The construction industry had been hit hard by the economic downturn, and even master carpenters weren't safe anymore. "We're consolidating operations," they'd said, moving everything to the main facility in Boston. They'd offered him a position there, knowing full well he couldn't leave his father's nursing home behind. Dad had built this company from nothing, taught Michael everything he knew about woodworking, and now Michael watched as corporate suits dismantled his father's legacy piece by piece. The tool belt in his hands was the last gift his father had given him before the dementia set in. Each tool had its own story. The hammer with the slight groove worn into the handle from decades of use. The carpenter's pencil his dad would tuck behind his ear, even at family dinners, the brass measuring tape that had mapped out countless dreams. Michael ran his fingers over the embossed initials in the leather, TF. Thomas Foster's craftsmanship lived in every house he'd ever built, every piece of furniture he'd lovingly shaped from raw lumber into something beautiful and lasting. The first month wasn't so bad. Michael had savings, enough to keep paying his father's care facility bills and maintain his small apartment. He sent out applications, made calls to old contacts, picked up odd jobs where he could, but in an industry where everyone was downsizing, experience often worked against you. Overqualified, they'd say. Or, "We're looking for someone more. Junior." The unspoken truth hung in the air. Younger meant cheaper. By the second month, the choices became harder. The nursing home or the apartment. His father's care won out without question. Michael moved his essential belongings into his pickup truck, sold what he could, and donated the rest. The truck became his home. Not so bad in the early fall. Weather, he told himself. He kept himself presentable at the local gym, took day labor jobs when he could find them, and visited his father every evening, telling him stories about jobs that no longer existed. "Remember that cherry wood cabinet we built for Mrs. Henderson?" he'd say, watching for any flicker of recognition in his father's eyes. "The one with the hidden compartment for her jewelry? She called it magic. How smooth that secret drawer slid out." Sometimes his father would smile, though Michael was never sure if he was remembering or just responding to the warmth in his son's voice. The tool belt became both his most valuable possession and his greatest temptation. He could have sold it. Quality tools like these would fetch a decent price, but every time he considered it, he heard his father's voice from decades ago. "Tools are like promises, son. You take care of them, they take care of you. Break that promise and you break something in yourself." So Michael kept the belt, even as autumn's chill crept into his bones during the long nights in the truck's cab. He took maintenance jobs that barely covered gas and his father's care, watched his savings dwindle to nothing, and held on to the one thing he refused to lose, his dignity. He might be homeless, but he kept himself clean, kept his tools organized, kept showing up. Some habits learned at his father's workbench were too deeply ingrained to break. The rain that had started on his last day at Riverside Woodworks seemed to follow him through those early weeks of homelessness. October in New England was unforgiving, and the truck's heater worked about as well as the economy. Each night grew colder than the last, and Michael found himself driving further into the wilderness, seeking sheltered spots where police wouldn't roust him for overnight parking. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. Winter was coming, and with it, decisions he wasn't ready to face. The storm hit just after midnight. Rain hammered against the truck's roof like shotgun pellets, and wind rocked the vehicle so violently that sleep became impossible. Michael had parked at the end of an old logging road, deeper in the woods than he'd ever ventured before, but now branches were coming down around him. He needed to move. Navigating the muddy track in the darkness, his headlights caught something through the trees, the angular shadow of a roofline. He almost missed it, obscured as it was by overgrown vegetation, but years of evaluating structures had trained his eye to spot the telltale signs of human construction. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its weathered grey boards barely visible. In his flashlight beam, a fallen tree rested against one corner of the roof, and thick vines crawled up the walls like grasping fingers. But beneath the years of neglect, Michael's trained eye saw potential. The foundation appeared solid, the roofline was straight despite its burden, and the wraparound porch, though sagging, spoke of craftsmanship from a bygone era. He approached cautiously, aware that abandoned structures often had inhabitants. Of the four-legged variety, the porch boards creaked under his weight, but held. The windows were grimy but intact, and through them he could make out shapes of furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. A brass knocker hung askew on the front door, its mounting screws loose but salvageable. Testing the handle, he found it locked. But something about the place pulled at him, awakening instincts honed over decades of restoration work. This wasn't just any cabin. This was craftsmanship worth saving. He circled the structure, examining every detail, the tongue and groove. Siding, though weathered, was old-growth pine that you couldn't find anymore. The window frames showed signs of hand-carved details beneath years of neglect. Someone had loved this place once, had built it to last. Around the back, he found a loose board near the foundation. Shining his flashlight into the gap revealed a crawl space, and there, glinting in the beam, was an old key hanging on a rusty nail. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Good builders always leave a way in, son. Sometimes things need fixing when nobody's around." The key was a heavy brass thing, ornate in a way they didn't make anymore. It turned in the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for someone who would understand its purpose. The door opened with a groan of ancient hinges, releasing the musty breath of long-closed spaces. Inside, the cabin was a time capsule. Sheets covered what appeared to be quality furniture, their shapes suggesting craftsman-style pieces that made his fingers itch to restore them. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel a single piece of hand-hewn oak that must have taken immense skill to install. The kitchen still had its original cabinets, their joinery speaking of careful hands and patient hearts. But it was the workbench in the corner that stopped him in his tracks. Tools hung on the wall above it, their shapes familiar as old friends beneath their shroud of cobwebs. This hadn't just been a vacation cabin, it had been someone's workshop, someone's sanctuary. Moving deeper into the space, Michael's flashlight beam caught something pale beneath a floorboard that didn't quite meet its neighbor. Kneeling down, he worked his fingers into the gap. The board lifted easily, revealing a small space beneath. Inside lay another key, newer than the first, alongside a folded piece of paper. The note, when he opened it, contained a single line. In faded ink, "For the one who sees the worth in things others have forgotten." Standing in that room, surrounded by the ghosts of craftsmanship past, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced since his last day at Riverside Woodworks: purpose. This place needed him as much as he needed shelter. Every loose board, every sagging beam, every clouded window was a challenge his hands ached to meet. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin, Michael Foster had found something more valuable than shelter. He had found a chance to rebuild not just a structure, but himself. As he swept his flashlight around the room one more time, his mind was already cataloguing, planning, seeing not what was, but what could be. He didn't know then about the camera hidden in the old clock on the mantel, its lens capturing the moment. When hope returned to his eyes, he couldn't know that miles away, in a penthouse office overlooking Boston's glittering skyline, someone else was about to discover that same hope through a simple security alert on a long-forgotten property. Sarah Blackwood's heels clicked against marble floors as she strode through her penthouse office, the sound echoing off floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Boston's financial district. On her desk, next to acquisition reports and investment portfolios, lay the morning's copy of the Boston Globe's business section. Her own face stared back at her from the cover, alongside the headline, "Tech Titan's latest romance ends in million-dollar lawsuit." She picked up the paper, scanning the article she'd already memorized. Sources close to the couple suggest that James Monroe, a rising star in venture capital, had been methodically documenting his relationship with Blackwood Industries' CEO, including text messages that suggested promises of investment in his startup ventures. The paper crumpled in her hands. Another one. They were all the same. Seeing her bank account instead of her face, her company instead of her character. At 38, she'd built Blackwood Industries into a $20 billion tech empire, transforming her father's failing software company into a global leader in artificial intelligence, and somehow that success had become a cage. Her assistant, Margaret, appeared in the doorway. "The lawyers have drafted a response to Mr. Monroe's claims. They're confident his case has no merit." She paused, then added more softly, "And your mother called again." Sarah closed her eyes. "Let me guess, she has another perfect match for me? Another nice young man from the right family? This time it's the heir to a pharmaceutical company," Margaret confirmed, her tone carefully neutral. "She mentioned something about combining industries." "Of course she did." Sarah turned to the window, watching her reflection overlap with the city skyline. "Because, heaven forbid, I might want to meet someone who sees me as something other than a business opportunity." Her phone buzzed. Another security alert from one of her many properties. She almost dismissed it until she saw the source. Cabin number 7, Western Massachusetts. The property she'd bought on impulse 6 months ago, after another disastrous relationship, had left her craving escape. She'd never even visited it, but something about the old carpenter's cabin in the woods had called to her. A place with history, with soul, far from the sterile luxury she'd surrounded herself with. Opening the alert, she found herself watching live footage from the cabin's hidden security system. A man was moving through the space, but not like a thief. His flashlight beam moved methodically, examining joints and beams with what appeared to be professional interest. She found herself leaning closer to the screen, intrigued by his careful movements. "Margaret!" she called out. "Get me everything we have on property number 7, the cabin in Western Mass." Within minutes, the files were spread across her desk. The previous owner had been a master craftsman who'd built the cabin himself in the 1960s. After his death, it had passed through several hands before ending up in a bank foreclosure. Sarah had purchased it through a shell company, like most of her private properties. She spent the next hour watching the man through the security feeds. He'd found the hidden key, something even her property surveyor hadn't managed, and was now conducting a thorough examination of the cabin's bones. There was something compelling about his reverence for the space, the way his hands traced the woodwork with understanding rather than assessment. Out of curiosity, she ran the footage through her company's facial recognition software, Michael Foster, age 42, former master carpenter at Riverside Woodworks until the company's recent downsizing. No criminal record, multiple commendations. For his restoration work on historical properties. He's homeless, Margaret noted, reading over her shoulder, living in his truck to keep paying for his father's nursing home care. Sarah sat back, something shifting in her chest. Look at how he's examining that workbench. He's not seeing dollar signs or square footage. He's seeing what you saw when you bought the place, Margaret suggested quietly. Possibility. The security feed showed Michael carefully covering. The furniture again, treating decades-old craftsmanship with a respect that spoke volumes. In a world where everything had a price tag, here was someone who understood the value of things that couldn't be bought. Sarah made a decision. Margaret, I need you to do something, but with absolute discretion. Have building supplies delivered to the logging road near the cabin. The basics at first. Lumber, roofing materials, tools. Make it look like surplus from another project that's being stored there. And if he uses them, then we'll send more. Sarah watched as Michael unrolled his sleeping bag on the cabin's floor, his movements speaking of bone-deep exhaustion, but also cautious hope. Let's see what he does with a little help. She didn't know then that she was about to become invested in more than just the cabin's restoration. As she watched this stranger treat her forgotten property with such care, something long dormant began to stir. A hope that perhaps there were still people in the world who valued substance over surface, who could see the worth in things others had abandoned. Dawn broke over the cabin, filtering through grimy windows to reveal what the flashlight's beam had only hinted at. Michael sat at the old workbench, a sheet of paper salvaged from his truck spread before him, sketching out what would become his restoration blueprint. His father had taught him to always start with a plan, to see the whole project before lifting the first tool. "Good morning," he said to the empty room, his voice startling a mouse that scurried behind the stone fireplace. The habit of talking to his workspaces was one he'd picked up from his father. "Let's see what we've got to work with." His pencil moved across the paper with practiced precision, creating a detailed floor plan. The cabin's bones were sound. That was the miracle of it. Whoever had built this place had known their craft. The foundation showed no significant settling. The main support beams were old-growth timber that could outlast another century, and even the roof's structural members remained solid despite the fallen tree's weight. But there were issues that needed immediate attention. The porch's supporting posts had rotted at ground level, creating the dangerous sag. Several windows needed reglazing, and the chimney would need inspection before he dared light a fire. Water damage around the north-facing windows suggested failing seals, and the kitchen pump would need complete rehabilitation. Michael created a priority list in the margin of his drawings. Safety first. Always safety first. The fallen tree had to be removed before it caused structural damage, and the porch needed stabilization before someone got hurt. He caught himself at that thought. Someone. As if this place would see visitors, as if this wasn't just emergency shelter for a homeless carpenter. Still, he couldn't help himself. His drawings expanded, detailing repairs that went beyond mere necessity. The built-in cabinets could be stunning with proper restoration. The fireplace mantel needed only careful sanding and refinishing to reveal its original glory. The windows, once properly sealed and cleaned, would flood the space with natural light. Standing, he retrieved his tool belt from the truck. The weight of it across his hips felt right, felt like coming home. He spent the morning doing a thorough inspection, documenting every issue, every potential repair. By lunch, a protein bar and an apple from his dwindling supplies, he had filled 3 pages with notes and sketches. The previous day's storm had left behind a crisp, clear autumn day. Perfect working weather. Michael began with the fallen tree, using a crosscut saw he found hanging in the workshop. The blade was old but well preserved, its teeth still sharp after a quick file job. The work was hard, but it felt good to have purpose again, to be doing something more than just surviving. As he worked, he kept talking to the cabin, explaining his plans as if the old place could understand him. "We'll get you squared away," he promised, cutting through another section of trunk. "One step at a time, just like Dad always said." The tree turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Once cut into sections, it would provide valuable lumber for repairs. Old oak like this was hard to come by, and Michael found himself planning how to make the most of every inch. The straightest sections could become support posts for the porch. The larger limbs would feed the fireplace once he'd certified the chimney safe. As the sun began to set, Michael unfolded his blueprint again, adding more details in the fading light. Tomorrow, he'd need to venture into town, find a hardware store. He had enough money left for some basic supplies, nails, sealant, maybe some roofing patches. Not much, but enough to start, enough to show this place that someone cared again. He didn't notice the small drone that briefly hovered at the edge of the clearing, its camera capturing his careful measurements and detailed drawings. Didn't see how those images were transmitted to a penthouse office where someone else was making plans of their own. That night, as he rolled out his sleeping bag on the cabin floor, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not just for shelter, but for the chance to create something meaningful again. His last thought before drifting off was of his father, and how proud he would be to see craftsmanship valued, to see his tools being used to bring beauty back to something abandoned. In his dreams, he was already seeing the cabin restored, sunlight streaming through clean windows, the porch a welcoming space where stories could be shared. He couldn't know then how close those dreams would come to reality, or that someone else was beginning to share them. Sarah sat in her home office, the wall of monitors before her displaying multiple angles of the cabin. She'd barely slept, caught up in watching Michael's methodical work through the security feeds. There was something mesmerizing about his approach, so different from the rushed efficiency she was used to in her world. "The first delivery is in place," Margaret reported, setting down a coffee and a manila folder. "Construction surplus from the Berkshire project, as you suggested. Left it at the logging road junction before dawn." Sarah nodded, picking up the delivery manifest. The supplies were basic but crucial. Pressure-treated lumber for the porch posts, roofing materials, industrial sealant for the windows. Everything his blueprint had indicated he'd need, but nothing too obvious or excessive. "He's going into town now," Margaret noted, gesturing to one of the screens showing Michael's truck pulling away. "Should I have the drone follow?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "We observe the cabin only. He deserves his privacy." She watched the truck disappear down the logging road, knowing he would soon discover the materials. Part of her worried he might be suspicious, might even be scared away, but something told her he wouldn't be, not when the supplies were exactly what the cabin needed. The folder Margaret had brought contained Michael's complete background. Check. His credit history told a story of someone who'd always lived within his means, until his father's illness struck. The nursing home bills had drained his savings, but he'd never missed a payment. References from previous clients spoke of exceptional craftsmanship and integrity. "The nursing home called," Margaret said quietly. "They received this month's payment for Thomas Foster's care. According to their records, Michael visited his father yesterday evening, read to him for an hour." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Even homeless, even struggling, he'd kept his commitments. She thought of her own father, of the company he'd built, of how she'd transformed it into something he'd barely recognize. When was the last time she'd visited his grave? The security feed pinged with movement. Michael's truck was returning, moving slowly. He must have discovered the supplies. Sarah leaned forward, watching his reaction through the cabin's cameras. Michael stood before the pile of materials, his expression a mix of disbelief and suspicion. He circled the supplies slowly, examining tags and labels. Sarah held her breath as he ran his hands over the lumber, checking its quality with expert eyes. "Look at that," she murmured. "He's not thinking about the cost. He's thinking about what he can create with it. Margaret smiled knowingly. Reminds me of someone else I know, before the board meetings and quarterly reports took over. Sarah shot her a look, but couldn't deny the truth in it. She'd started coding at 12, built her first program because she loved the artistry of it, the way elegant code could create something beautiful and useful. When had that joy been replaced by profit margins and market share? Through the cameras, she watched Michael begin transferring the supplies to the cabin. He was methodical, organizing materials by purpose, treating every piece with care. No waste, no shortcuts. His father's tool belt caught the morning light as he worked, its worn leather speaking of years of similar tasks. "He'll need more," Sarah said, making notes. "The window repairs will require specialized glass. The chimney should be professionally inspected before winter." "And how do we explain these mysterious appearances?" Margaret asked. "Eventually, he's going to have questions." Sarah watched as Michael began measuring the new lumber against his blueprints. "For now, we let him work. There's something important happening here. I'm not sure I can explain it." "You don't have to," Margaret said softly. "I haven't seen you this invested in anything since you wrote your first line of code." The morning passed as Sarah alternated between her corporate responsibilities and checking the cabin feeds. Michael had already begun replacing the porch posts, his work precise and careful. She found herself holding conference calls while watching him measure twice, cut once, each movement deliberate and skilled. A notification popped up on her screen, another tabloid alert. This one speculated about her recent breakup, suggesting she was already seeing someone new. The same old stories, the same assumptions about the lonely rich woman who couldn't keep a relationship. She closed the alert without reading it, turning instead to watch Michael work. Here was someone who understood value beyond price tags, who saw beauty in forgotten things. Here was someone real. "Margaret," she called out, "schedule a site visit to the Berkshire project for next week. I think I need to inspect things personally." Her assistant's knowing smile said she wasn't fooled for a moment. "Of course. Shall I include a detour through the logging roads in the itinerary?" Sarah turned back to the screens, watching as Michael transformed rough lumber into something strong and true. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think it's time I saw this restoration for myself." Over the next week, the cabin's transformation began in earnest. Michael worked from sunrise to sunset, his only breaks coming when he needed to pick up odd jobs in town to maintain his father's care payments. Each day brought new progress, captured meticulously by the hidden cameras that had become Sarah's window into a world she was increasingly reluctant to look away from. The porch came first. Michael replaced the rotted posts with sections from the fallen oak, carefully matching the original craftsmanship. He spent an entire day on the joinery alone, creating mortise and tenon joints that would last another lifetime. "See, Dad?" he'd say to the empty air as he worked. "Just like you taught me. No shortcuts." Sarah found herself recording clips of his work, creating before and after comparisons that she watched during her corporate meetings. The transformation was more than physical. It was artistic. Where others might have simply shored up the sagging structure, Michael restored it to its original glory, even improving upon the design with subtle reinforcements against future water damage. The windows came next. The mysterious supply pile had included premium glass and sealant, and Michael put them to perfect use. He removed each window with painstaking care, salvaging the original wooden frames that had been hand-carved decades ago. Hours went into stripping, repairing, and refinishing each frame before installing the new glass with the precision of a surgeon. "Look at how he's preserving the old while incorporating the new," Sarah murmured, watching him work through the feeds. "He understands that progress doesn't mean destroying history." Margaret, who had taken to joining her for these observations, nodded knowingly. "Unlike some developers we know who'd rather tear down and rebuild." The chimney inspection revealed issues that would have daunted a lesser craftsman. The original stonework needed repointing, and the flue required extensive cleaning. Michael approached the challenge methodically, researching techniques at the local library and consulting with a retired mason in town who was happy to share his knowledge in exchange for help with his own home repairs. Each evening, after the physical labor ended, Michael would sit at the workbench and update his restoration plans. The cameras caught him comparing his progress photos with the original blueprints he'd drawn, making adjustments, planning the next day's work. These quiet moments, when his guard was down, were when Sarah felt most like an intruder, and yet couldn't look away. "He's not just fixing a building," she said one evening, watching him carefully sand down a section of the original wainscoting. "He's healing something in himself, too." The cabin's interior slowly emerged from decades of neglect. Michael cleaned and restored each piece of furniture he discovered beneath the dust covers, revealing masterworks of craftsmanship. A rocking chair that had lost its sway found its rhythm again under his careful repairs. A roll-top desk with stuck drawers was coaxed back to smooth operation. Sarah found herself especially moved by his treatment of the original builder's tools. He cleaned each one reverently, testing their balance and edges, restoring them to working condition before hanging them back in their places. "Tools are memories," she heard him say to the quiet workshop. "Each one holds the hands that shaped it." The before and after photos became Sarah's most precious possessions, downloaded and stored in a private folder on her personal laptop. They told a story that went beyond mere renovation. They showed rebirth, both of the cabin and the man who worked on it. The sagging porch now stood proud and welcoming. Windows that had been clouded with age now sparkled in the autumn sun. The workshop, once a maze of cobwebs and dust, had become a sanctuary of ordered tools and warm wood. But it was the small details that touched her most deeply. The way Michael had repaired the brass knocker on the front door, spending hours polishing it until it gleamed like new. The careful reconstruction of the window boxes, ready for spring flowers that he had no guarantee he'd be around to plant. The handmade replacements for missing decorative trim, carved to match the originals so perfectly that only the slight difference in wood aging gave them away. He's not doing this for himself, Sarah realized, watching him spend an entire afternoon perfecting the fit of a single cabinet door. He's doing it for the cabin itself, for its history, for whoever comes next. Margaret, sorting through corporate acquisition papers nearby, looked up at the wonder in her boss's voice. "Sounds like someone else I know," she said softly. "Someone who used to code for the joy of creation, not the size of the IPO." Sarah touched the screen where Michael's hands moved with such certainty over the wood. In his work, she saw an echo of something she'd lost. The pure pleasure of creating. Something beautiful, something lasting, something real. The security alert on her phone reminded her that tomorrow she would finally see the cabin and its carpenter in person. She'd planned the visit carefully, making sure it would seem like a chance encounter. But watching Michael put the finishing touches on the repaired porch railing, she wondered who was really restoring what. Sarah's designer hiking boots were a mistake. She realized this halfway up the logging trail, their pristine leather already scuffed and muddy from the uneven terrain. The morning fog hung heavy among the trees, and she'd deliberately left her usual security detail behind, telling them she needed to inspect the Berkshire property alone. "You're sure about this?" Margaret had asked earlier, helping her exchange her usual tailored suit for what they imagined a casual hiker might wear, though the outfit probably cost more than most hikers spent on a year's worth of gear. Now, adjusting her path to avoid another mud patch, Sarah questioned her own plan. What exactly was she hoping to accomplish? She'd watched this man for weeks through cameras, invaded his privacy, manipulated his circumstances with anonymous deliveries. How could any genuine connection emerge from such an artificial foundation? The sound of sawing drew her attention. She followed it, deliberately scuffing her boots on the path, making enough noise that her arrival wouldn't startle him. The fog was thinning, and through the trees she caught her first unfiltered glimpse of both the cabin and its carpenter. Michael was on the newly restored porch, working on what appeared to be a replacement railing spindle. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, and his movements had the sure grace of someone completely in their element. The cabin behind him looked transformed from the security footage, more alive somehow, as if it had awakened under his care. She must have made some sound, because he looked up, his hands stilling on the wood. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the clearing, the morning mist swirling between them like unspoken words. "I'm so sorry," Sarah managed, falling back on her rehearsed story. "I think I'm lost. I was hiking the ridge trail and somehow—" She gestured vaguely at the woods behind her. Michael set down his tools, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Pretty easy to lose your way in this fog." His voice was warmer in person than it had sounded through the cameras, with an undertone of quiet strength. "You've wandered about 2 miles off the main trail." "Oh no," she said, trying to sound appropriately concerned, while drinking in every detail of him. The tool belt at his hips was even more worn up close, its leather darkened by years of honest work. His eyes were kind, but cautious, evaluating her just as she was evaluating him. "I don't suppose you could point me in the right direction." He glanced at the sky, then at her inappropriate footwear. "Storms moving in. Those ridge trails get dangerous in the rain." He seemed to debate with himself for a moment before adding, "You're welcome to wait it out here. I just got the fireplace certified last week." The invitation surprised her, even though she'd hoped for it. There was something in his manner, not quite suspicion, but a careful reserve, as if he were used to people having ulterior motives. If he only knew. "I don't want to impose," she said, but a distant rumble of thunder made the decision for her. "Though I would appreciate it. Thank you." He led her up the porch steps, and she couldn't help running her hand along the railing. He'd so carefully restored. The wood was satin smooth under her fingers, telling the story of hours of patient sanding and finishing. "Beautiful work," she said before she could stop herself. "This isn't just a repair job, it's a restoration." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, pleasure, and perhaps a touch of pride. "You know something about woodwork?" "My father—" she began, then caught herself. This was supposed to be a chance encounter, not a confession. "He appreciated craftsmanship, taught me to recognize quality work." Inside, the cabin took her breath away. The security feeds hadn't done justice to the transformation. Every surface glowed with careful attention, from the restored hardwood floors to the gleaming window panes. The furniture she'd seen covered in sheets now stood proudly revealed, each piece telling its own story of renewal. "I'm Sarah," she offered, realizing she'd been staring. In all her planning, she hadn't decided whether to use her real name, but something about the honest work surrounding her made lies feel impossible. "Michael Foster," he replied, gesturing toward the stone fireplace, where a small fire already burned. "Please make yourself comfortable. I was about to make coffee if you'd like some." She sank into one of the restored armchairs, its embrace somehow both firm and yielding. Through the window she could see the storm clouds gathering, nature conspiring to extend this moment. Michael moved around the kitchen with the same deliberate grace he brought to his woodwork, and she found herself studying him openly, seeing him fully as a person rather than a figure on a screen. What struck her most was his dignity. Despite circumstances that would have broken many, he carried himself with quiet confidence, secure in his skills and his worth. It was so different from the artificial assurance she encountered in her corporate, a world where worth was measured in stock prices and market share. The coffee he handed her came in a carefully restored mug, its glaze showing subtle age cracks that had been lovingly preserved rather than disguised. Like everything else in the cabin, it felt real in a way her world rarely did. The storm arrived with theatrical timing, rain drumming against the newly sealed windows while thunder rolled across the valley. Michael had found an old radio in the workshop, and now it crackled with weather updates from a local station, its vacuum tubes, giving the announcer's voice a warm, vintage quality. "Looks like we're in for a few hours of this," Michael said, adding another log to the fire. "The ridge trails will be slick until morning." He didn't sound particularly concerned about hosting an unexpected guest, though Sarah noticed how he kept himself busy, as if uncertain how to handle simple conversation after so many weeks of solitude. "You've done amazing work here," Sarah said, hoping to draw him out. "The way you've preserved the original character while making it functional again, it's remarkable." He paused in his adjusting of the firewood, and she saw that hint of pride again quickly hidden. The bones were good. Someone put their heart into building this place. Seems wrong to let that kind of craftsmanship go to waste. "How did you find it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The question felt like another betrayal, but she needed to hear his version, his truth. Chance, really. Or fate, if you believe in that sort of thing. He settled into the chair opposite her, finally allowing himself to rest. "I was looking for shelter during that big storm a few weeks back. Found the key, found a note." He trailed off, as if realizing he might be saying too much. Sarah leaned forward, clutching her coffee mug for warmth and perhaps courage. "A note. For the one who sees the worth in things others have forgotten," he quoted softly. "Felt like a sign, I suppose, though I'm not sure what right I had to take it as one." The guilt twisted in Sarah's stomach. She had never seen that note during the property inspection. It felt like the cabin itself had been waiting for someone like Michael, while she had only seen it as an escape route. A particularly loud crack of thunder made them both jump, and the radio's weather update grew more serious. Flash flood warnings, road closures, warnings about downed power lines. The storm was settling in for the night. "I should check the generator," Michael said, rising. "Power gets spotty up here in weather like this." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you'd rather not be left alone with a stranger in a remote cabin during a storm." The comment startled a laugh from her, the first genuine one in longer than she could remember. "Honestly, I feel safer here than I have in a long time." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes. "I'll be quick. There's more coffee in the pot if you'd like." While he was gone, Sarah found herself drawn to the workshop corner. His restoration plans lay on the workbench, detailed drawings that showed both what the cabin had been and what it could become. Next to them sat a small photo album she'd never seen through the cameras. Inside, she found carefully documented before pictures of each repair, along with notes on techniques and materials. "My father taught me to keep records." Michael's voice came from behind her, making her start guiltily. "Said you never know when you might need to prove you did things right." "You must miss him," she said softly, seeing the love evident in every careful notation. "He's still here in a way." Michael moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "In the nursing home, his memories come and go. But when I visit, I tell him about the work I'm doing here. Sometimes I see a spark, like he understands, like he's proud." The generator hummed to life outside, just as the power flickered and died. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimacy that felt both comforting and dangerous. Sarah knew she should maintain her distance, stick to her story of being a lost hiker, but something about the storm, the firelight, and Michael's quiet strength made pretense feel impossible. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "All this careful work when you don't even know if you'll be able to stay?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Some things are worth doing right, even if they're not yours to keep." He looked around the cabin, his gaze touching each restored piece with something like affection. Maybe especially then. The radio crackled with static, and Michael adjusted it, bringing the weather report back into focus. Sarah watched his hands move over the old dials with the same care he showed to everything else. She thought about her own world, where everything was disposable, replaceable, valued only for its market price. "Tell me about this," she said, pointing to a particularly complex joint detail in his drawings. "I've never seen anything like it." His face lit up with quiet enthusiasm, and as the storm raged outside, he began explaining the intricacies of traditional Japanese joinery. Sarah found herself drawn into his world of precision and patience, where value was measured in durability and beauty rather than dollars and cents. Neither of them noticed when the radio's weather updates faded to static, or when the fire burned down to embers. They were too caught up in the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge, of being understood, of finding unexpected common ground in a storm-dark cabin, far from both their normal worlds. Morning arrived with the aftermath of the storm. Fallen branches scattered across the clearing, and a massive oak tree blocking the trail Sarah would have used to return to her fictional hiking route. She found herself secretly grateful for the excuse to stay longer. "That's going to take some clearing," Michael said, surveying the fallen oak. "But it's good wood. Hate to see it go to waste." He was already eyeing the trunk with a craftsman's assessment, seeing potential where others might see only obstacle. "I could help," Sarah offered, surprising herself. Her schedule was probably imploding with missed meetings, but somehow that seemed less important than this moment. "I mean, if you're willing to teach me." He looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in full daylight, she fought the urge to fidget under his gaze, knowing her designer hiking clothes were a mess from the night's adventures. But his eyes held no judgment, only a thoughtful consideration. "Ever used a crosscut saw?" he asked. "No, but I'm a quick learner." The work was harder than anything Sarah had ever done. Michael taught her the proper stance, the rhythm of the saw, the importance of letting the tool do the work. Her hands, more accustomed to keyboards and touchscreens, quickly developed blisters. But there was something deeply satisfying about the physical effort, the slow progress through the solid wood. "My father would have loved this," Michael said, as they paused for water. "He always said wood had a memory, that it remembered every hand that shaped it." He ran his fingers along the grain of the fallen oak. "This tree's been growing here since before either of us was born. Seems right to give it a new purpose." They worked through the morning, sectioning the trunk into manageable pieces. Michael showed her how to read the grain, explaining which sections would be best for different uses. The largest portions, he decided, would become benches for the porch. Other sections could be milled down for repairs or split for firewood. "Nothing goes to waste," he explained, showing her how even the smallest branches could be useful. "Nature doesn't waste anything. Everything has a purpose, even if it's not obvious at first." Sarah found herself sharing stories as they worked. Carefully edited versions of her life, but truer than any she'd told in recent memory. She told him about learning coding from her father, about the joy of creating something from nothing, though she left out the billions those creations had eventually earned. "It's not so different from what you do," she said, helping him roll a log into position, seeing the potential in raw material, shaping it into something useful. "Except you can delete your mistakes," he smiled. "Wood's not so forgiving. You have to think 3 steps ahead because some mistakes can't be undone." By afternoon, they had transformed the fallen tree into neat piles of sorted lumber. Sarah's muscles ached, her clothes were filthy, and she felt more alive than she had in years. She watched as Michael marked each section with chalk, noting its intended purpose. "The porch could use some seating," he said almost hesitantly. "If you'd like to see how these become benches, though I'm sure you have somewhere else to be." She should say yes. She should make her excuses, return to her world of boardrooms and balance sheets. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'd like that. To see the whole process, I mean, if you're willing to teach me." The smile that crossed his face made her heart skip. It wasn't the polished, practiced smiles she was used to. It was real, reaching, all the way to his eyes, crinkling the corners with genuine pleasure. Together, they carried the first log up to the porch, where Michael had set up a makeshift workspace. He brought out his tools, laying them out in precise order. Each one had been lovingly restored, their handles smoothed by generations of use. "First rule," he said, picking up a handplane. is to understand your material. Every piece of wood has its own character, its own story. Our job is to listen to what it wants to become. As the afternoon sun played through the autumn leaves, Sarah found herself drawn into his world of precise measurements and careful cuts, of grain patterns and growth rings. She learned to feel the difference between a sharp blade and a dull one, to understand why certain tools were handed down through generations. And all the while, the hidden cameras she'd installed captured everything, their lenses recording this unexpected chapter in both their stories. The old wood stove had proven to be another hidden treasure of the cabin. Michael had spent days restoring it, cleaning decades of soot from its cast-iron surfaces and carefully repairing its mechanisms. Now it radiated warmth through the kitchen. As he taught Sarah how to make his father's signature stew, a recipe born of necessity but perfected through years of practice. The secret, he explained, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon he'd carved himself, is patience. You can't rush good food any more than you can rush good craftsmanship. Sarah watched him work, noting how his movements in the kitchen echoed his precision at the workbench. Her own world was one of personal chefs and five-star restaurants, but there was something compelling about this simple meal prepared with such care. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked, dicing carrots under his guidance. Her knife skills were clumsy compared to his practiced efficiency, but he showed the same patience with her learning as he had with the woodworking. "My mom passed when I was young," he said, checking the temperature of the stove with an experienced hand. "Dad did his best, but he worked long hours building the business. I started cooking out of self-defense. A kid can only eat so many. Burnt grilled cheese sandwiches." He showed her how to layer the ingredients, explaining how each addition contributed to the whole. The vegetables they'd bought from a local farm stand that morning. Some herbs he'd discovered growing wild near the cabin. Simple ingredients transformed by time and attention. "It's like everything else worth doing," he said, adjusting the flame. "You have to understand your materials, respect their nature. You can't force things to be what they're not." The words hit too close to home, and Sarah felt her smile falter. Here she was, pretending to be something she wasn't, building what felt increasingly like a real connection on a foundation of lies. The guilt that had been simmering all day threatened to boil over. Michael must have noticed her change in mood. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" "Just thinking," she managed. "About authenticity, about being real." He was quiet for a moment, stirring the stew. "That's been on my mind too," he admitted. "Being here, in this cabin, it's the first time in a long while I've felt like myself, not defined by what I've lost or what others think I should be." The stew simmered, filling the cabin with warmth and savory aromas. Sarah set their makeshift table. 2 chairs they'd restored together, bowls they'd found in the cupboards and carefully washed. Such simple things, yet they felt more meaningful than any of the elaborate dinner parties she regularly hosted. "Tell me about your father," she said as they sat down to eat. "The real stories, not just the woodworking lessons." Michael's face softened in the lantern light. He was complicated. Brilliant with his hands, not so good with words. He showed love through teaching, through passing on what he knew. He took a thoughtful bite of stew. "Even now, with the dementia, sometimes when I tell him about the work I'm doing here, I see that old spark, like he's still teaching me, even if he can't say it out loud." Sarah thought of her own father, of coding sessions that stretched late into the night, of the pride in his eyes when she solved a particularly challenging problem. "I understand," she said softly. "My father was similar. He believed in creating things that would last, that would make a difference." "And did you create things that lasted?" The question was innocent, but it made her chest tight. She had created things, a tech empire, a fortune, a carefully cultivated public image. But sitting here, in this honest space filled with the smell of homemade stew and the warmth of real connection, none of those creations felt quite as meaningful as they once had. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She'd managed to get a weak signal earlier in the day. She ignored it, but Michael noticed her tension. "Real world calling?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Something like that. She took another bite of stew, savoring its simple perfection. This is amazing, by the way. Your father would be proud. I'll teach you the recipe, he offered, if you want to come back another time. The hope in his voice made her heart ache. She wanted nothing more than to come back, to learn more, to be the person he thought she was. But Margaret's texts were growing increasingly urgent, and she knew her carefully constructed world wouldn't wait forever. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it more than any words she'd spoken in years. The truth arrived with the morning paper. Michael had walked into town for supplies, and there it was, staring up at him from the rack outside Mason's general store. Sarah's face on the cover of Business Weekly. Tech titan Sarah Blackwood's latest power move: AI giant acquires rival for $4.2 billion. His hands trembled as he read the article, each word hitting like a physical blow. Sarah Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries. Net worth, $20 billion. Recent acquisitions, market strategies, corporate takeovers. It was all there in black and white, along with a photo of her in corporate attire that made her attempt at hiking gear seem almost laughable in retrospect. The walk back to the cabin was a blur. The paper burned in his hand like an accusation. Everything made sense now. The mysterious building supplies, the too convenient storm, her careful questions about the property. He'd been a fool, seeing what he wanted to see instead of the truth that had been right in front of him. She was waiting on the porch when he returned, working on the bench they'd started together. She looked up with a smile that died when she saw his face. "Planning any hostile takeovers of abandoned cabins?" he asked, tossing the magazine onto the workbench. Between them, the sound it made against the wood was like a gavel falling. Sarah went very still, her hands frozen on the half-finished bench. "Michael, I can explain." "Explain what? How you've been watching me? Those mysterious supplies that kept appearing. That was you, wasn't it? All this time you've been what? Studying me like some kind of social experiment?" "No." The denial burst from her with such force that he almost believed it. "It wasn't like that. Yes, I own the cabin. Yes, I had cameras installed for security. But everything else, everything that's happened here, was a lie," he finished for her. The betrayal felt physical, like a splinter working its way into his heart. "You let me pour myself into this place, knowing it was yours all along. Did you enjoy the show? The homeless carpenter trying to rebuild something meaningful?" "That's not fair." She stood up, and he could see tears in her eyes. "What happened here was real. The work we did together, the conversations we had. While you were lying to me with every breath, playing at being a lost hiker, pretending to learn skills you probably pay people to handle. Was any of it real, Sarah? Or was I just another acquisition target?" The words hit her like slaps, each one leaving its mark. "You're right about the deception," she said quietly. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning. But you're wrong about everything else. What I saw here, what you created, it woke something in me I thought I'd lost. Something real." "Real?" He picked up his father's tool belt from the workbench. "Real is showing up every day to do honest work. Real is building something with your own hands, not manipulating people and situations from behind security cameras." "Michael, please." She reached for him, but he stepped back. "Let me explain about the cameras, about why I bought this place." "Don't bother." He began gathering his tools, each one a memory of lessons learned at his father's side. "The cabin's yours. You don't need to evict me. I'll be gone within the hour." "That's not what I want." The desperation in her voice made him pause. "This place, it was dead before you came. Just another property acquisition. You brought it back to life. You made it mean something again." He looked around at the work they'd done together, the restored porch, the half-finished bench, the windows that now sparkled in the morning light. Every repair held a memory. Her laughter as she learned to use a plane, the quiet conversations over coffee, the shared satisfaction of work well done, all of it tainted now by the knowledge of her deception. "You know what the worst part is?" he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I would have understood. If you'd been honest from the beginning about owning the place, about wanting to restore it, I would have helped anyway. Because that's what craftsmen do. We build things, we fix things, we make broken things whole again. He shouldered his bag of tools. But trust? Once that's broken, all the skill in the world can't repair it. The last thing he saw as he walked away was Sarah standing on the porch they'd restored together, her hand resting on the railing he'd taught her to sand, surrounded by all the truth and lies they'd built between them. Michael's tool belt lay where he'd left it, forgotten in his haste to leave. The first time in 25 years it had been separated from him. Sarah stood in the cabin's doorway, staring at this piece of him that remained, unable to move or think beyond the magnitude of what she'd just lost. The leather was worn smooth by decades of use, each tool slot shaped by muscle memory and daily ritual. It represented everything she'd come to admire about him: dedication, craftsmanship, honesty, everything she'd betrayed with her deception. Her phone rang. Margaret, probably with another crisis that now seemed meaningless. She let it go to voicemail, sinking down onto the porch steps where just yesterday they'd sat together, planning the bench that now stood unfinished behind her. The security feed still ran, their screens now showing empty rooms and abandoned projects. She could see the kitchen where they'd cooked together, the workshop where he taught her the patience of hand-planing wood, the fireplace where they'd talked through the storm. Each camera that had once let her observe his work now only recorded the absence he'd left behind. In her office across the state, acquisition papers waited for her signature. Board members waited for decisions. An empire waited for its queen to return. But here, in this cabin that had somehow become more real to her than that entire world, Sarah Blackwood finally faced the truth about herself. She'd spent her life building walls of wealth and power, thinking they would protect her from the pain of connection. But Michael had shown her another way, the value of building bridges instead, of creating something meaningful with your own hands, of being genuine even when it left you vulnerable. The tool belt caught the afternoon light, its leather holding the memories of both father and son. She touched it gently, feeling the years of honest work embedded in its grain. This wasn't just a collection of tools, it was Michael's heritage, his identity, his link to his father. And in his pain and anger, he'd left it behind. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her mother. "Darling, I've arranged a dinner with Richard Chen's son. His medical tech company would be a perfect merger opportunity." Sarah stared at the message, seeing for the first time how her entire life had become about acquisitions and mergers, about seeing people and relationships as assets to be managed. She'd done the same thing here, thinking she could orchestrate and control this connection with Michael like just another corporate takeover. But real relationships, like the craftsmanship Michael had taught her, couldn't be forced or manipulated. They had to be built carefully, honestly, with attention to detail and respect for the materials at hand. She'd forgotten that somewhere along the way, buried it under spreadsheets and stock options. The sun was setting now, painting the cabin in shades of gold that highlighted every repair, every restoration Michael had lovingly completed. Each one told a story of patience, of seeing worth in damaged things, of bringing beauty back to what had been abandoned. Sarah picked up the tool belt, its weight substantial in her hands. She couldn't leave it here, couldn't let this piece of him be lost, but she also couldn't keep it, couldn't add theft to her list of betrayals. She knew where he would go, back to his truck, back to his daily visits to his father, back to the struggle of maintaining dignity in a world that had turned its back on him. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who could buy anything, had finally found something precious that couldn't be purchased. And he, who had so little in material terms, had shown her a wealth she'd forgotten existed. The cabin creaked and settled around her, its restored bones singing with craftsmanship and care. But without Michael's presence, without his vision and dedication, it felt hollow again, just another empty property in her vast portfolio. She had built an empire by seeing potential where others saw obstacles. Now she needed to find a way to rebuild something far more valuable: trust. But trust, like the joinery Michael had taught her about, couldn't be rushed or forced. It had to be earned, piece by piece, through actions rather than words. Night fell, and Sarah remained on the porch, the tool belt in her lap, surrounded by the echoes of what they'd almost built together. Tomorrow she would have to return to her world of boardrooms and balance sheets. But tonight she let herself feel the full weight of her mistakes and began to plan how she might make things right. The first snow of the season fell silently over Boston's financial district, dusting the windows of Sarah's penthouse office with white. She stood at the glass wall, watching the flakes swirl past, each one a reminder of time running out. The weather report on her desk warned of an unusually harsh winter approaching. In her hand, she held Michael's worn leather tool belt, which she'd been carrying with her for days now, unable to decide how to return it. The tools felt heavy with responsibility, each one representing a skill passed down, a lesson learned, a connection to his father that she had no right to keep. The security feeds from the cabin still ran on one of her monitors, showing empty rooms growing colder. The fireplace that had once radiated warmth stood dark and silent. The half-finished projects waited like abandoned promises. The bench. They'd started together. The cabinet doors they'd planned to rehang. The window boxes that would never see spring flowers. The board is waiting, Margaret reminded her gently from the doorway. The Chen merger won't proceed without your sign-off. Cancel it, Sarah said, still watching the snow. Cancel all of it. The merger, the acquisitions, the expansion plans. Sarah? Margaret's concern was evident. In 15 years, she'd never heard her boss speak like this. I've spent my life acquiring things, Margaret. Companies, properties, assets, thinking that having more meant being more. She turned from the window, decision crystallizing. But I watched a man with nothing rebuild something priceless simply because he saw its worth. I need to find him. Finding Michael proved harder than she'd expected. He'd stopped using his credit cards, disappeared from his usual haunts. The truck she'd watched through surveillance was no longer parked in its regular spots. As temperatures dropped below freezing, her worry grew. The only constant was his father's nursing home. He wouldn't abandon those visits no matter what. But when she arrived there, the staff informed her that Michael had already come and gone, reading to his father for an hour as always, despite the growing cold. He seemed different today, the nurse told her. Sadder, maybe. When his father asked about the cabin, he has moments of clarity, you know. Michael just held his hand and changed the subject. Outside the nursing home, the snow was falling faster, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they were made. Sarah sat in her car, the tool belt on the passenger seat beside her, and made another decision. She pulled out her phone. Margaret, I need you to set something in motion. It's going to take every contact we have, and it needs to happen before this storm gets worse. Across the city, Michael huddled in his truck, watching his breath fog. The windows. The temperature gauge had stopped working months ago, but he could feel the bitter cold seeping through the metal. Without his tools, finding work had become nearly impossible. His savings were depleted, and his father's care payments loomed. He thought about the cabin, not just the shelter it had offered, but the purpose it had given him. Every repair had been a chance to prove that broken things could be made whole again, that value wasn't always measured in dollars and cents. The snow gathered on his windshield, each flake a reminder of what he'd walked away from. Not just the warmth of the cabin, but the warmth of connection he'd felt with Sarah. Despite her deception, despite everything, he couldn't deny that what they'd shared had been real. His father's words echoed in his memory. Sometimes, son, pride costs more than we can afford to pay. The truck's heater sputtered weakly as the storm intensified. Weather reports on the radio warned of dangerous conditions, of record-low temperatures approaching. Emergency shelters were opening across the city, preparing for a night that promised to be one of the coldest in recent memory. Michael pulled his coat tighter, remembering the heat of the cabin's wood stove, the satisfaction of work. "Well done!" The look in Sarah's eyes when she'd finally understood the joy of creating something with her own hands. He'd walked away from all of it because of pride, because of hurt, because sometimes it was easier to be right than to be warm. The snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blank white sheet that erased the boundaries between wealth and poverty, between pride and necessity, between past and future. Somewhere in that whiteness, two people who had briefly shared a vision of something genuine faced the same cold night, each wondering if some things, once broken, could ever truly be repaired. Christmas Eve brought the kind of cold that made the world feel brittle, like everything might shatter at a touch. The city's homeless shelters were filled beyond capacity as the temperature plummeted to record lows. Sarah had visited 6 of them already, the leather tool belt clutched in her hands like a talisman. At the 7th shelter, housed in an old church basement, she finally found him. Michael sat alone at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, staring into its depths as if searching for answers. He looked tired, worn thin by weeks of winter and wounded pride. He didn't look up when she approached, though she knew he sensed her presence. "Your father's nursing home called," she said softly. "They said his payment for next month was taken care of. All future payments, actually. I didn't ask for your charity." His voice was rough with cold and hurt. "It's not charity." She set his tool belt on the table between them. The leather gleamed softly in the fluorescent light, freshly conditioned, but still bearing all its years of honest work. "It's an investment in craftsmanship." That made him look up. She'd dressed simply this time. No pretense, no costume, just Sarah as she really was. "I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about what you taught me," she continued. "About seeing the worth in things others have forgotten, about building something real." Around them, the shelter bustled with Christmas Eve activity. Volunteers served dinner, handed out blankets, tried to bring some warmth to those seeking refuge. From the bitter night, string lights hung from the ceiling, their soft glow reflecting off the frost-covered windows. "The cabin misses you," she said when he remained silent. "All those half-finished projects, all that potential. It feels wrong, leaving things incomplete, like your surveillance equipment." The words held less bite than before, more weariness than anger. "I had it all removed." She met his eyes steadily. "No more cameras, no more hidden observation. Just honest work, if you're willing to consider a partnership." That got his attention. Partnership? Sarah pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside were drawings, professional architectural plans based on his original restoration sketches. "I want to expand the project, turn the cabin and the surrounding land into a craft school, a place where traditional skills can be taught, where things of value can be preserved and passed on." She paused, watching his expression. "But it needs a master craftsman to oversee it. Someone who understands that some things can't be rushed. That authentic work takes time and patience." Michael opened the plans, his carpenter's eye automatically assessing the details. The drawings showed workshops, small cabins for students, gardens, and at the center the original cabin restored to serve as both home and heart of the school. "Why?" he asked finally, looking up from the plans. "Because you were right about me. I've spent my life acquiring things, measuring worth in dollars and market share, but watching you work, seeing how you brought that cabin back to life, it woke something in me, something real." She gestured at the plans. "This isn't about money or power. It's about creating something meaningful, something that will outlast both of us." Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes illuminated by the streetlights. Through the shelter's windows, they looked like falling stars, each one carrying a wish, a possibility. "Your father's care is covered either way," Sarah added quietly. "That's not contingent on your answer. I needed you to know that some things are worth more than pride, Some mistakes deserve a chance at restoration. Michael ran his fingers over his tool belt, feeling the familiar worn spots, the places where years of work had left their mark. Dad always said that the true test of craftsmanship isn't in making something new, he said finally. It's in how you repair what's broken. Sarah held her breath, hearing the deeper meaning in his words. Around them, the shelter volunteers had begun singing carols, their voices rising soft and hopeful in the gathering night. The porch benches need finishing, Michael said at last. And those window boxes won't build themselves. Is that a yes? He stood, shouldering his tool belt with the ease of long habit. It's a beginning. The rest, like everything worth doing, will take time to build right. Together, they walked out into the snowy night, leaving behind the shelter's warmth for something less certain but more real, the chance to rebuild not just a cabin but trust, purpose, and perhaps something even more valuable. The cabin welcomed them back with creaking timbers and cold rooms, like a reproachful parent greeting wayward children. Their footprints in the fresh snow were the first to mark the porch in weeks. Michael moved immediately to the wood stove, his hands remembering their purpose as he prepared kindling and logs. No cameras, he noted, glancing at the empty space where the hidden lens had been. As promised, Sarah stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, unsure of her place now that pretense had been stripped away. I had them all removed the day after you left. The fire caught quickly, hungry for purpose. While Michael tended it, Sarah retrieved something from her car, a thick, leather-bound book she'd spent weeks preparing. She set it on the workbench, waiting for him to notice. What's this? He approached cautiously, drawn by the craftsmanship of the binding. A proper record. She opened it to reveal detailed photographs of every repair he'd made to the cabin, alongside his original sketches and notes she'd carefully preserved. Every restoration, every technique, every decision you made. I thought it could be the beginning of the school's teaching archive. Michael's hands hovered over the pages, recognizing his work, documented with unexpected reverence. You kept all this? I kept everything. She turned to pages filled with legal documents. Property deeds, business registrations, permits. The land around the cabin, all 40 acres, is now held in trust, not owned by me or my company, but dedicated to the preservation and teaching of traditional crafts. She paused, watching his reaction. With you, as master craftsman and lead. Instructor if you want it. The fire's warmth began to reach them as Michael studied the documents. His eye caught a detail that made him look up sharply. This trust, it's named after my father, the Thomas Foster School of Traditional Craftsmanship. Sarah's voice softened. I visited him, you know, last week during one of his clear days. Showed him the plans, asked his permission to use his name. You did what? Michael's voice cracked slightly. He showed me his hands. All those years of work written in the calluses and scars. Said these were his credentials, better than any degree. She smiled at the memory. Then he told me to make sure we teach the students about proper grain alignment, because apparently that's a lost art these days. Michael turned away, but not before she caught the shimmer in his eyes. He moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered land that would become his teaching ground. It's a big dream, he said finally. Too big? No. He turned back to her, and for the first time since their reunion, really smiled. Just big enough to be worth doing right? They spent the rest of the morning going over the plans in detail. Michael's practical knowledge tempered Sarah's grand visions, while her resources and connections opened possibilities he'd never imagined. They talked about class sizes, curriculum development, apprenticeship programs. The first students could start by helping restore these outbuildings, he mused, marking up the plans. Learn by doing, just like I did with Dad. Speaking of learning by doing, Sarah retrieved a small box from her coat pocket. I think it's time I return to my apprenticeship, if the teacher is willing. Inside the box was a new carpenter's pencil, a simple tool that carried the weight of possibility. Michael took it, testing its weight as he had once tested hers. Your technique needs work, he said, but his eyes were warm. "And no more pretending to be a beginner when you've already learned the basics." "No more pretending at all," she agreed. Together they bent over the workbench, beginning to sketch out the details of their shared future. Outside, the winter sun emerged from the clouds, casting their shadow on the wall as one shape. The teacher and the student, the craftsman and the dreamer, building something neither could create alone. Spring came early to the woods that year, as if nature herself was eager to witness the transformation taking place. The sound of construction filled the air as the first workshop building took shape beside the cabin. Michael had designed it himself, incorporating elements from traditional timber frame construction that would serve as teaching tools for future students. "See how these joints work?" he explained to a group of local teenagers who had started showing up after school, drawn by curiosity about the project. "This is called a mortise and tenon joint. It's been used for thousands of years because it's stronger than any nail or screw." Sarah watched from the cabin's porch, smiling at how naturally he fell into the role of teacher. She'd worried that her corporate background would overshadow the school's craft-focused mission, but Michael had found ways to blend both their strengths. While she handled the administrative framework that would allow the school to thrive, he focused on developing a curriculum that would preserve traditional skills. The workshop plans lay spread out on a table between them, marked with both architectural notations and Michael's hand-drawn additions. "We'll need a dedicated space for hand tools," he was saying, sketching in another detail. "Students should learn to use these before they touch any power equipment. Like I did." Sarah picked up a hand plane, demonstrating the smooth motion he'd taught her months ago. Her technique had improved considerably, though she still sometimes caught him adjusting her grip when she wasn't looking. "Exactly." His approval warmed her more than she cared to admit. "You understand now why it matters. That's what we need, to pass on. Not just the skills, but the why of it all." The local kids had become unofficial apprentices, eager to learn and unafraid of hard work. Michael taught them the basics of wood selection, tool maintenance and joinery, while Sarah showed them how to document their progress and create project plans. Together, they were building more than just a school. They were creating a bridge between traditional craftsmanship and modern necessity. "Mr. Foster!" One of the teenagers, Jimmy, called out excitedly, "Come look at this joint I cut." Michael walked over to inspect the boy's work, his father's tool belt now accompanied by a teacher's patience. "Good clean cuts," he praised, running his fingers along the wood. "Now tell me why you chose this grain pattern." Sarah turned back to her laptop, where applications for the first official class were starting to arrive. They decided to start small. Just 12 students for the inaugural year-long program. The responses had surprised them both. Artisans looking to deepen their skills, young people seeking alternatives to traditional education, even corporate professionals hoping to reconnect with something real. A familiar voice carried across. "The construction site. Now that's what I call progress." They turned to see Margaret walking carefully through the muddy ground in her city shoes, carrying a large tube of blueprints. Behind her came an elderly man in a wheelchair, accompanied by a nursing home aide. "Dad," Michael's voice caught as he hurried forward. "What are you doing here?" Thomas Foster's eyes were clear today as they took in the scene before him. The rising workshop, the eager young apprentices, his son's tools being used to build something lasting. "Couldn't let you do all this without my inspection, could I?" he said with a hint of his old humor. "Though it looks like you've got things well in hand." Sarah watched as Michael showed his father around the site, explaining each detail of the construction, each choice of material and technique. The older man nodded approvingly, occasionally offering suggestions that Michael noted carefully. The teenagers gathered around, instinctively recognizing another master craftsman in their midst. "This beam joint here," Thomas said, pointing. "With a trembling hand, we used to call that a marriage joint, because once it's together, it never comes apart." Sarah caught Michael's eye across the construction site, sharing a moment of understanding. Some connections, once properly made, were indeed permanent. The key was in the careful preparation, the honest joining, the respect for the materials. At hand, as the day's light began to fade, they gathered on the cabin's porch, Michael and his father, Sarah and Margaret, the young apprentices eager to learn. The workshop's skeleton rose against the darkening sky, its timbers solid and true, ready to shelter generations of craftsmen to come. 1 year to the day after Michael first discovered the cabin, he stood at his workbench, putting the finishing touches on a small wooden box. The wood was from the oak tree that had fallen during the storm that brought him here. The same storm that had inadvertently set this whole journey in motion. The box's joinery was complex, featuring the same traditional techniques he now taught his students. Inside, a hidden compartment operated by a mechanism so subtle that only careful fingers would find it. The final touch was the inlay on the lid. 2 interlocking rings crafted from different woods, their grains flowing together in perfect harmony. Sarah found him there, late in the evening after the last of the day's classes had ended. The school was everything they'd hoped for, and more. 12 students had become 24, with a waiting list that grew longer each month. The original cabin served as both home and heart of the campus, its restored warmth extending to the workshop buildings and student quarters that now dotted the property. "Another project?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder as she studied his work. "Something like that." He ran his fingers over the box's smooth surface, checking one last time for imperfections. "Remember what you said when you first saw my work here, about recognizing quality?" "I remember everything about those days," she said softly, "even the parts that weren't entirely honest." He turned to face her, the box cradled in his hands. "You know, in woodworking, sometimes the strongest joints are the ones that have been broken and properly repaired. The glue can make the wood stronger than it was originally." He took a deep breath. "Kinda like trust when you think about it." Sarah's eyes widened as he opened the box. Inside the hidden compartment lay a ring, handcrafted from the same oak as the box itself. Like everything Michael made, it was both beautiful and practical, designed to last a lifetime. "I'm not a billionaire," he said quietly. "I can't offer you empires or corporate mergers, but I can offer you something real, something we can build together." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she touched the ring. "You know, I gave all that up," she whispered. "The empire, the acquisitions, none of it meant anything compared to what we've created here." Through the workshop window, they could see the lights of the school buildings glowing in the dusk. In the main workshop, a few dedicated students still worked on their projects, their shadows moving behind the windows. The sound of a hand plane sliding across wood carried through the evening air, a sound as old as craftsmanship itself. "Besides," Sarah added with a watery smile, "I'd say you've built quite an empire of your own here. These students, this school, you're passing on something more valuable than money." "We built it together," Michael corrected her. "Your vision, my skills. Like that marriage joint Dad talked about. 2 pieces coming together to make something stronger than either could be alone." Sarah picked up the ring, admiring how the grain caught the light. "Is this what you were working on all those late nights?" "Had to get it right," he grinned. "Can't have the students thinking the teacher's work isn't up to standard." "It's perfect," she said, and they both knew she meant more than just the ring. He slipped it onto her finger where it fit, as if it had always belonged there. Outside, the first stars were appearing above the trees that had witnessed their entire story. The cabin creaked gently in the cooling air, its restored bones settling into another night. Tomorrow would bring more students eager to learn, more projects to complete, more dreams to build. But for now, they stood together in the workshop where it had all begun, surrounded by the tools and materials of their trade, bound together by something stronger than fortune or fame, the simple, lasting truth of work well done and love honestly earned. Through the open door, they could see the porch where they'd first talked, the benches they'd built together, and beyond them, the future they'd crafted from broken trust and second chances. Like the finest woodwork, their story had been shaped by careful hands and patient hearts, proving that with skill and dedication, anything of value could be restored, renewed, and made whole again.